The Big Light presents
It's not very easy to just get on with your life if you're having these breaks where you think that you're having God's baby or something, or you have magical powers or anything like that.
My name is Halina Rafai, and this is the A Sonic Hug podcast. Over the coming episodes, you're going to hear the voices of people from different walks of life who deal, experience, and battle mental health issues. In this episode, I speak to Yvette Caster. Yvette's been a journalist for over 20 years for the likes of The Times, The Metro, and more. She also co-presents the Metro's weekly mental health podcast, Mentally Yours. I recently guested on an episode of the podcast talking about agoraphobia, so I was really humbled to be able to speak to Yvette about her experiences. Here she talks about her journey with bipolar disorder. There is discussion around depression, mania, and suicide that some people may find difficult listening. This is Yvette's story.
So I've got bipolar disorder. I've written about that a fair bit and just about it on the podcast as well. Started to become that apparent from quite an early age. I think when I was a kid, basically, I had periods of depression around 14. They were sort of so bad that I got taken to the doctors. But at that point, we didn't know that that was bipolar disorder. It was just thought that maybe it was depression. And then when I was 17, I had my first manic episode. So I got very ill, lost touch with reality, had delusions. And that kind of carried on for a couple of weeks. And I ended up going to a young person mental health unit and gradually got better. Ended up kind of partly going to that unit and then partly going back to sixth form. But at that point, I wasn't actually diagnosed. I'm sure a lot of your listeners might sort of relate to this, but you sometimes don't get diagnosed for quite a while. I think with bipolar disorder, the average is about 10 years that it can take. For me, I think it was about 6. So even though I'd had depression and a manic episode, I wasn't diagnosed and I wasn't on any sort of medication then. So then I went off to uni and had periods of depression and mania again. Yeah, I think it was about when I was 24, having had quite a few more of these episodes, that I went to see a doctor and decided to go on long-term mood stabilizers. So it took a little bit of a while, actually, looking back. But for some people, it can take longer. Going on mood stabilizers, that's made a huge difference to my life because I haven't had a severe manic episode since then. And I'm 40 now. And so having gone on the mood stabilizers at 24, it made, a really huge difference. Although I do still find I get periods of depression. I've definitely had periods of hypermania despite being on the mood stabilizers. So it's not like the mood stabilizers have been the sort of magic cure for everything, but they've definitely made a difference, I think. In terms of mania and hypermania, so I've got bipolar 1, there's also bipolar 2, and there's various other types as well. With bipolar 1, people do tend to have both mania and depression or periods of those. So mania for me was characterized by, lots of delusion. So, going into details about that, the first one that I ever had when I was 17, I believed that I had magical powers. I kind of completely forgot about anything to do with going to school or anything sort of to do with everyday life. I just got really sort of caught up in the beliefs that weren't true. I believed all kinds of sort of strange things. Other than that, like, one point I thought I could breathe underwater. So it's lots of, things that, for me, it was been delusions. I think for some people, they can also hear voices and possibly have hallucinations. But for me, the periods of mania have been very much about delusions. The strange thing about delusions is that when you've come out of them and you're kind of back to, in air quotes, normal, it can be hard to kind of let go of some of those beliefs. I mean, obviously not sort of things like, believing you can breathe underwater. But for example, another fairly common delusion I had at one point was believing that my house was bugged. And so it can be hard when you've sort of gone back to normal to actually completely sort of let go of that belief, I think, which might sound a bit strange to people. who haven't experienced them. So that's mania. In terms of hypomania is kind of like a level down from that. So you're still kind of in touch with reality. You could still be going about your day-to-day life. You could still be going to work. You could still be meeting up with friends even. But things are very sort of much, what's the right word? I suppose geared up, like faster paced. You might be speaking a lot faster. You might find that you're writing lots of, like for me, it was like writing lots of poetry or just writing lots of stuff in general. Speaking very fast, doing things like, spending a lot more money than usual. That's something I've sort of gone through. That can be quite common for people. It's basically like you just become very impulsive, or that's how I experience it. So for example, you might, I don't know, see an ad for something, go to the seaside, and you've seen an ad, and you literally just suddenly jump on a train and go to the seaside. So it's kind of like you're living on your impulses. You're not having sort of delusions. You're maybe a little bit less sort of logical, or you definitely, it's more about kind of living on your impulses. Actually, another thing that I find can happen is that I'll start lots of different jobs. So it can be very hard to sort of finish a task. So you might, start with writing a poem, then you go off to do something else. And then you go off to do some cleaning, then you go off to something else. But none of these jobs get finished. And then the opposite of that is sort of the periods of depression where everything can sort of seem to slow down and it can be very difficult to do anything. And for me, even I think my voice kind of gets slower, and it's, like the thought processes can get slower, and everything sort of a bit like walking through treacle or something. When I was in periods of mania, I put myself in some positions of harm. During one of them, I got it into my head that it would be a good idea to go out and sleep on the streets because I had all these weird thoughts sort of coming at me. I only did that for maybe a couple of hours, and then I've sort of moved on and somehow managed to get back home. But that could have been potentially quite dangerous because it was, when I was living up north, and it was extremely cold, and also just a young woman kind of being laid out on the street in any kind of situation is not particularly ideal. I think that was probably the most dangerous. I feel lucky that I haven't had the delusion that, for instance, I've thought I could fly or anything like that. I suppose in periods of mania, I haven't really put myself in danger. Thinking about it, actually, all the periods of depression have really been where the danger has come in, because I've got to the point where I've been suicidally depressed. That's, as it sounds, feeling so low that I wanted to end my life. When I was a teenager and I was struggling with my mental health, this was a few years ago now. I'm kind of in the 90s. And mental health wasn't really talked about so much. There were some brilliant people like Stephen Fry who had written about it and spoken about it. There were few and far between the people talking about it, even with the periods of depression that I initially had. But certainly when I had the manic episode and going to the young person's mental health unit, I suppose I dealt with it. Well, I didn't deal with it in terms of talking to friends about it. I basically just kind of pretended that it hadn't happened. So when I went back to sixth form, after being away to a young person's mental health unit, I just told people that I'd had glandular fever rather than actually talk about mental health at that point. Because, there was a lot of stigma around it. I think there's still a fair bit of stigma now, to be honest. I think it's easy for people who haven't really experienced it to think, oh, well, everyone talks about mental health now, but actually it can still be really difficult, especially if you sort of had your first really difficult period of mental illness, to then talk to people about it. I had some lovely friends, but I didn't talk to any of them about it. I had some lovely friends also at the young person's mental health unit. I suppose that really helped, because if I'd wanted to talk to them about it, I could have done. But again, with them, actually, even with them, we didn't really talk about it in great depth, but we sort of had this mutual understanding. I think that really helped. My family were really good in that they were very supportive in the practical stuff. For instance, I had a period during my time at uni where I came back home and I was depressed and I just couldn't get out of bed. So my parents were then kind of still feeding me and looking after me, and then eventually managed to convince me to go to the GP to get antidepressants, which really helped. But in terms of talking to them, I didn't manage to talk to them about it because I was sort of struggling with mental health. And also, my family doesn't really chat about mental health. There was definitely a lot of sort of stigma around just the conversation, or I felt there was. And I guess it was fairly lonely thinking about it. But one really lovely thing that happened when I got a little bit older, and was also at university, was that I had a conversation with my first serious boyfriend. He knew that I'd sort of been unwell, and I was worried that I maybe couldn't be normal. I couldn't have like a relationship because of all the stuff that had been going on. And he just said, I don't care. I still love you. And I think that's still one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me. Because just before that, I kind of really felt that the normal life I'd expected was just at an end. I was just sort of this broken person. So when I went to the young person's mental health unit, the things that helped me feel better, I think, were honestly, the companionship of the other young people. Although we didn't really talk a great deal about our mental health struggles, we'd have these kind of group counselling sessions. And I remember sitting there listening politely to what other people were saying and just saying absolutely nothing about myself. Having that sort of fellowship and doing things like just watching TV together or doing these activities together that they came up with for us, like all these sort of artistic projects or musical project. That was very helpful. I think it's strange because, thinking about it, I really didn't talk to them about what had happened to me or how I was feeling or anything like that. But I think just knowing that we were sort of in the same boat together was really good. I also had a really lovely, I think he must have been a psychotherapist or psychiatrist. I'm not sure, but basically he was sort of looking after my case, and he described to me what I'd been through. And to be honest now, he was really describing bipolar disorder, because he was describing, in air quotes, sort of like the average people go through moods sort of up and down a little bit throughout their life. Whereas with you, sort of, they're just more extreme. I'm doing a wave. I always sort of try and draw this out in the air when I'm talking about this, but basically my moods are just sort of a lot higher and lower than some other people's. And that was very helpful to hear that. But at that point, he didn't then say, oh, well, but we think you've got bipolar disorder and this is what we're going to do to treat it. Because I think there's a hesitancy with young people. I think for some, they might just have one blip and not have any sort of other issues down the line. I honestly don't know, because I'm not an expert, but I assume that's why they don't sort of initially diagnose people a lot sooner. But yeah, so he was helpful in kind of helping me to understand my brain a little bit more. And we had nurses there who were supportive. There was the nurse who initially came out to my house to convince me to go to the young person's mental health unit. And I sort of felt that I could trust her, and that I sort of told her about, because at that point I'd sort of was thinking about ending my life again. And she had a really sort of kind air to her. And I suppose I don't know what it was. Actually, no idea. It's very superficial. It was because she was actually quite young. And she was very pretty, and I don't know, but she also had a very sort of warm, sort of kind air to her. I hadn't managed to sort of tell my parents that I was feeling that bad. They knew that things were bad, but I hadn't really managed to vocalize it. Yeah. Also crucially, I think the other young people there, I suppose it might seem a bit strange because I didn't go on medication at that point, but to an extent, sort of just waiting for my mood to kind of get a bit better. So just time itself was quite healing, I think. So I've mentioned mood stabilizers. So they've been the drugs that have really been helpful for me. When I was 24, I got put on this one called Depakote. Usually, if you have bipolar disorder, you tend to go on either lithium or kind of valproate, which is the one I'm on, the Depakote. There are some other ones actually, but I forget what they're called. I think it seemed to work fairly quickly actually, because it's a little while ago now, because I first went on it when I was 24 and I've literally been on it ever since. There have been some side effects, but I think compared to given sort of the amount of my life they've given me back, I think it's worth it. One thing I noticed when I initially went on it was that actually weirdly day to day, I felt a little bit more emotional, which might sound a bit strange. I'd find that I'd kind of maybe cry a bit more at films and things like that, which was a bit odd. In terms of side effects, I think I had a bit of weight gain. It's hard to know how much of that is medication and how much of that is kind of everyday life, but also how much of that is bipolar disorder as well. Because I know I have a tendency to, when I feel low, to eat to feel better anyway. So that can obviously make me gain weight a lot more than the side effect of going on a pill. The main thing is I haven't had these sort of really extreme manic episodes that I was having where I, completely lose touch with reality. They'd just be sort of frustrating because if you think about it, I was kind of trying to live my life and just head on with things. So, at 17, I was just trying to get through GCSEs and my A-levels. And I just wanted to get that done. And then at university, I just wanted to, make friends and get my degree. And then my first job, I was just trying to do all right in journalism and work at a local paper. It's not very easy to just get on with your life if you're having these breaks where you think that you're having God's baby or something, or you have magical powers or anything like that. It just interrupts your life. But in terms of the Depakote now, it still seems to be working, touch wood. I think I'm probably going to have a conversation with my GP again quite soon about maybe something to do with antidepressants, because I've noticed I've been getting sort of a bit more low mood than before, but it's a bit of a delicate balance with bipolar because I don't want to risk things going the other way. So going into hypomania. When I was diagnosed, I was absolutely relieved because I'd been having all these up and down. I mean, really, I'd been having periods of depressions, I believe now, since I was a kid. And I'd been having, the manic episodes since I was 17. So to finally have a name for it, I can't say that I was happy about it. I did have some fear around the words and what might the future hold, but it was a relief because, if you know what the issue is, then you can properly start to treat it and you can learn about it and you can manage it. And I had a really great doctor who talked to me about it. And he said, well, look, I've got a heart condition and I just have to get on with it and I just have to manage it. And I take these pills regularly and I do certain exercise and I sort of look after my diet. And that's just what I do. And that's kind of been the way that I've thought about it. So I know it's not the same really, but it helps me to think of it as the equivalent of as if I had a long-term physical issue, because then you just think, well, this is just the name for it. And I'm going to take these pills and I'm going to do this and that and things that help basically, rather than fear it or believe that it's somehow an integral part of my personality or my life. Although saying that, it sort of is kind of part of my personality, I suppose, in a way. Yeah, it's tricky. When I was first diagnosed, definitely for a good sort of 10 years, a lot of it was about sort of just still me keeping things to myself, still not talking to friends about bipolar disorder, taking my pill, seeing my doctor, just getting on with things kind of privately. And then when I got into working for Metro, so I was there as their head of blogs, it was a time when lots of people were doing pieces, which was sort of first person pieces. And I kind of felt at that point that I got onto the national newspapers. When I was younger, I was on regional papers, but it took me a while to get onto national papers. And I got a fairly sort of secure, decent position at a national paper, so at Metro. And at that point, I mean, I suppose because I was a bit older as well, I was about sort of 30 odd or almost 30. I just thought, well, I think part of it was kind of what's the worst that can happen now? I mean, I've got a secure job. I've done all right. My mental health hadn't been sort of perfect over those years, but it had been a lot better than when I was younger and before my diagnosis and before the mood stabilizers and before I was sort of managing things better. I think I just kind of thought, sod it, I'm going to write about this now. And it was sort of on the cusp of when people were just starting to write a lot more and talk a lot more about mental health. So I felt like, I think I was kind of part of that wave of a lot more stuff coming out online about it. And once I started, I just carried on and carried on. The first piece I wrote was a very crude listicle because back then it was all about listicles online because they did very well. And yeah, it was quite a crude piece called, I think about 15 things you only know if you've gone mad, because we're always doing these pieces like 21 things you only know if you love the series Friends or all these sort of stuff. But I just thought, no, I'm going to write this about mental health. And yeah, it is quite a crude piece, but I did that first piece and, I wrote that and I was so nervous about it. I was so scared, but I knew I wanted to do it, hit publish on it. I mean, I know it helped some other people because I got a nice response from it. But I think before then, I'd been thinking maybe the sky would fall if I did write about it and talk about it. And honestly, it was absolutely nothing happened. I mean, I've had a really lovely chat to my deputy editor. He came up to me, very kind. But, there wasn't some sort of big, terrible thing. It's not like I suddenly got fired. It's not like everyone in the office suddenly turned around and pointed their fingers at me or people like my friends at work shunned me or anything like that. It was a real relief, actually. And I realized it was fine to talk about this stuff and write about this stuff and it might actually help people. So then I went on to write a lot more sort of considered pieces and more specific pieces. So I wrote about bipolar disorder and my experiences of that. And I wanted to write things that are a bit more detailed. So covering things about relationships and dating if you had a mental illness and how to navigate that sort of stuff. And then the next thing that one of my colleagues, Ellen Scott, and I decided to do was to set up a podcast for metro.co.uk, because at that point there actually weren't many mental health podcasts. There's quite a lot now, which is brilliant because I think, it doesn't matter where people find help or support about mental health as long as they find it somewhere. So we set that up in 2017. And we put out an episode every week since then. That's been really lovely because when we set that up, we just wanted to chat to people with lived experience of mental health and hear their side of things sort of right across the board. And also in my day job, I was also commissioning a lot of pieces, again, from people with lived experience of mental health so that they could sort of share their experiences and hopefully help other people who are struggling feel better. So thinking back to when I was younger, one thing that really helped when I'd mentioned to one friend that I had been feeling low is that this friend sent me a lovely postcard. And on the front of it, it just said, if you ever need to talk, I'm here, and had sort of some cute cartoon, but it also had her number. And it was just really kind of her to send that and to know that she was thinking about me. And that actually made a really huge difference. So I think I'm so thankful for her doing that. Although that's something that actually happened, I think that things along those lines can really help. And I suppose more things like that would have helped me. But then that is kind of dependent on me speaking to friends and family about what I'm going through. I think what else might have helped would be actually, more people in the public eye speaking about mental health issues. Because for me, I was incredibly ambitious when I was a teenager. I had this idea that if I was mentally ill, I couldn't have I couldn't have a successful life. But when I sort of heard that Stephen Fry also lived with bipolar disorder, that really helped me because, again, it seemed like a quite superficial thing, but obviously he's an incredibly successful man. He's worked in all these different areas, comedy, acting, writing, narration, all these fantastic things. Nobody would argue that he's, incredibly successful, but he also happens to have bipolar disorder. For me, it did help knowing that. And I think it might have helped if I'd known about other singers or people that I admired, if they'd come out to say that they lived with different mental health conditions. And the great thing is that they are now. It's so hard when you're sort of stuck in something like depression because you literally, the whole thing around it is you just isolate yourself. You don't feel like you can reach out. Going back to that postcard, what was great about it is that I'd been sent it and it was this physical thing sitting in my room reminding me that somebody actually didn't think I was completely worthless. The thing is, I never actually rang her, but to actually sort of see that there was very supportive. I mean, these days I could sort of go on for ages as well about all the fact that I think there should be a lot more support for people a lot sooner. It's incredibly frustrating because you can start talking about mental health issues, and saying that you're feeling low, but you might not get an appointment for a very long time. And then when you do get an appointment, it's only kind of a few sessions, which isn't nearly enough. That's the kind of thing that I find really heartbreaking at the moment. I think the support for younger people is better than it is for adults, but I still don't think it's anywhere near what it should be. I mean, I've heard from doing the podcast stories about young people who've had to go to young people's mental health units, which is sort of miles and miles away from where they live, which would have been totally disastrous for me because it was helpful that mine were close to my home and also close to my school. If I'd had to go up, miles and miles away, like some of the young people we've spoken to, that would have really made things a lot harder and maybe made me wanting to go to the young person's health unit. So at the risk of having a big rant about how much more investment there needs to be in the mental health system and how much thought needs to be put into it, people need to get help a lot sooner. The government needs to make a lot more changes. If you speak to mental health nurses who work in it at the moment, things are in a bit of a state. If money was no object and, the mental health system could be transformed tomorrow, I'd just really love to see people getting treatment sooner, like the minute that you make a phone call to your GP sort of saying that you're struggling with your mental health, you literally get an appointment that day and you get a counselling session from that day onwards and a whole series. You need months and months, not just a series of, a couple of months, which is at the moment. I think there could be a lot more in terms of positive things like supportive outreach programs, activities or exercise programs that people could do. And I mean, I'm the last person to sort of say to anyone, oh, if you're depressed, go for a run. But I think what I mean more is it would be really lovely if money was no object for there to be kind of groups that people could go to if they're struggling with their mental health, where they could just go and have a coffee and chat to people, maybe a mix of professionals and people who are struggling with similar. Because one thing that I've found that's helpful for me when I'm struggling with depression is to have sort of plans to socialize. Groups like that real investment in support for people with mental health. But also, God, this is the crucial thing for me, not waiting until people are in crisis, because that's how we're dealing with it at the moment. We're really only helping people when they're in a crisis, and you shouldn't have to only get help when you're a danger to yourself or other people, because there's so many shades of grey sort of before you get to that, and you might never get to that. And really, would you want anybody to actually get to that sort of extreme? We need to be seeing people much, much sooner and giving them so much support, not waiting until they're, really struggling, and then suddenly, rushing them to hospital and dealing with the issue then. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say.
That was Yvette's story. I have great respect for anyone that talks about their journey on this podcast, but I think sometimes I have to remind myself what it can take when you're talking to someone who you perhaps don't know so well. Yvette's journey is a complex and challenging one. The empath in me is immediately moved to tears thinking about her as a 14-year-old child going through what she did. There was one question I forgot to ask Yvette, and that is, would you change things if you could? I don't want to assume, but part of me thinks no. I, of course, would take away all the suffering she went through if I could, but another part of me is thankful that she's been able to help be part of a movement of awareness. Without her, things could have been quite different. Here is an account that highlights the importance of medication and the stability it can bring, but also an account that helps reduce the stigma not only surrounding medication but bipolar disorder. Yvette's explanations around her experiences of mania and hypermania will no doubt be an education for many also. The relief of receiving a diagnosis is something that is one of the most vital aspects for many. The not knowing in any situation can further exacerbate things and can increase fear, but also create exhaustion and loss of hope. I do question the time frame over diagnosis here, and that's something I would like to explore more as these series go on. There were a couple of significant moments in Yvette's conversation for me when she was talking about being in the young person's mental health unit. Firstly, her mention of the importance of time. When we're working through things as humans, the ability to just have time to work through things without outlying pressures is important. The other moment was her mention of her and the other young people not necessarily talking about what they were going through, but just knowing in the back of your head why other people were there and all being in the same boat. I suppose this is another thing that relieves pressure, as there's no need for justification, which in itself is another realm of exhaustion. Like numerous others who've told me their stories and expressed what they would like to see change or move forwards, prevention versus cure is one of the biggest. Her recommendation of people being seen, spoken to and supported almost immediately would have no doubt one of the biggest impacts on people. Imagine being able to get support within a day. How extraordinary would that be? And it's sad that I even comment on how extraordinary that would be. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you for your Mentally Yours podcast. Thank you for your writing and your work. And perhaps if you're listening to this and you've been on your journey, or you know someone struggling, why not drop them a line with your number or contact and let them know that you are there, just thinking of them, much like Yvette's friend. Sometimes it's the biggest gift. If you have experienced or are experiencing anything described in this episode, you will find support information in the text to accompany this podcast. A Sonic Hug is recorded, edited and produced by me, Halina Rafai. We are also part of Scotland's podcasting network, The Big Light. Until next time, deep breaths.
From the Big Light Studio,